aren't you, Iwana? Oh, she's on spring break. Never mind. Okay. Exploratory data analysis tries to summarize data and draw conclusions based on whole population. Inferential statistics, what you're trying to do here is, what this is it's the process, it's a process of collecting data in the form of a sample and again draw conclusions There we go. So we are trying to draw a conclusion about the entire population based on the data that we get in a sample. Key, trying to draw conclusions for the whole population. If the data we get in our sample is flawed, then we're not going to have an accurate conclusions about the whole population. I'll give you an example of this. If you've ever been to visiting a town and you're driving through town and you just happen to run across a couple bad drivers that cut you off and maybe show you some of their fingers or maybe just one of their fingers, etc., then you're probably going to draw certain conclusions about the population of that town based on those few individuals. But do those few individuals accurately represent the entire population? Now, I know when I'm driving, I certainly enjoy cutting people off and flipping people the bird, but I'm not representative of our town. I think we have a lot nicer people than that. So if you happen to run into me, you would draw the wrong conclusions, but for other people, if you ran into other people, maybe they would better represent the entire population of our city. Another example of what I'm talking about here is in an Ann Landers article that she wrote once. She talked about the following. If you'll take a look on page 245, let's look at this. This is the headlines for one of her columns. 70% of parents say kids are not worth it. And they had 10,000 people, 10,000 parents that wrote in and said that indeed they would not. Ooh, I think was that thunder? We having an earthquake in here? Karen, the other Karen doesn't even notice. She's in there sniffing her perfumes and stuff. 70% of parents say kids are not worth it. Well, if you had kids like this, ooh, now that's my nephew Connor. Now if you had someone like that, now he would certainly be worth it, I would think. Of course, if you had someone like that, maybe my mom would be one of the ones that said that it wasn't worth it. So these 10,000 people go, well, that's a big number. So maybe these 10,000 people would certainly accurately represent the entire population. If you could zoom out a little bit there for me. Well, here's the entire population. And if you take a sample there, that 10,000 people, do they accurately represent this? Well, actually, they don't, because this was the people that wrote in. The people that wrote in were motivated to do so. Why? Possibly they weren't happy with their particular kids at the time, so that might be a good explanation. Another possibility, there could be some other possibilities, but probably the biggest thing there was they weren't happy with their kids at the time. So now if you had some kid like that, okay, catching rockfish, you remember this guy, this handsome young guy. Now certainly, that fancy hairdo, certainly now the parents could not, these type of parents would never write in because they have kids like that, they certainly would be happy. But what happened was these parents probably were very upset with their kids, and so they wanted to write in. Were the people that were not unhappy or they were okay or there was no problem, then they probably didn't bother to write in. This is called voluntary response. Let's take a look at this on the notes here. This is called a, let me show you this on the book too. So you can see it's a voluntary response sample. A voluntary response sample is when the people that respond to your survey do so based on their desires to. There's nothing statistically proper about that, and you have a problem with that. We're going to talk about that shortly. The thing that I want you to understand then is if you don't have a sample that accurately represents the population, then you're going to have problems. That's why we need to study the collection of data first before we actually start talking about random samples that we get. So let's take a look here. Sampling, therefore, and this is a math term. Have you ever seen that? That means therefore in math, mathese. Sampling has big implications for, or actually in, science, social studies, etc. Because all of these fields, it could be English, it could be art, it could be a lot of, but especially these, and including math, because you deal with collecting data and drawing conclusions about populations. And so how you go about sampling, how you go about collecting your data is a big issue when it comes to these different content areas. And so that's why that's the first thing that we're going to study. And before we move on to part one, surveys, let me just clarify here. Sampling is a process for collecting sample data So that's what we mean by sampling. It's just the process that you go through to collect your data, your sample data, and the intention is to use that to represent your population. And I think so far in this tape I don't have